on the subject of the relationship between the Jews and German music, rather than the Jews and the Germans.
Right.
What's the first thing that comes to
The first thing that comes to mind is the role of music as an instrument of acculturation. Fact remains is that when the emancipation took place in the late 18th century, culture, or in German Bildung, became a crucial instrument by which the Jewish progressive, Haskalah, reformist constituency thought they could show equality. Now, the trouble with showing equality is in the use of language, for example. For Yiddish-speaking groups, let's say, that came to Germany in the 19th century, the speech, racists always heard a Jewish element in the speech, in intonation, in articulation. In some regions where high literacy was rare, very sophisticated literacy became a Jewish phenomenon. This is true, for example, in Poland, where you could be identified as a Jew by the high quality of Polish you spoke, because the extent of illiteracy was so great. So language is a very complicated medium to show acculturation. Music is the most rapid instrument of assimilation because its fundamental medium is non-representational and does not reveal its carrier, that is to say. The number of young pseudo-prodigy violinists that went with their parents to Vienna to be the next sort of young star. Take the case of Joseph Joachim, who became an enormous power in German music. His actual biographer and the son of that biographer, Hans-Joachim Moser, became a Nazi. One of the irony is that the descendants of the Joachim school, many of them became Nazified. And one of the real bones of contention during the Nazi era was what to do about the Beethoven concerto, which had the Joachim cadenza, and the same with the Brahms concerto. So Joachim is a good example. Here was a Hungarian Jew who managed to enter the highest realms of German cultural society through the medium of his violin playing. He also tried to be a composer and was a very good one, but his real career was as a player. And here the medium was, in a way, a culturally neutral one. It was the pride of a German tradition, music, and here was the newcomer in one generation, in the very same generation, could achieve equality, which was much harder to do in the theater and certainly harder to do in the visual arts. So music, all this sort of what I would say is abstract nonsense about music being a universal language, which it is not, hides a real truth, which is that music is a self-contained game of rules. And therefore, playing it well, doing it well, actually makes assimilation or acculturation easier. It had neither a religious nor a cultural overtone. You didn't have to betray your language, whether it be Yiddish or Hebrew. Hebrew was not really a common daily language, but Yiddish certainly. And therefore, you could bridge both worlds and enter a new one. So music was an ideal instrument of assimilation. The first generation of assimilation after Moses Mendelssohn's death was a very aristocratic one, very much located in the salons of Berlin. People like Rachel Levin, von Warnhagen. And there the socializing that was around culture, philosophy, music, and so forth, was very extensive. Then came the early 19th century with shocking explosions, the Hep riots and so of anti-Semitism. And already people like the critic Riel, already with Mendelssohn's death in 1847, with the rise of German nationalism, an anti-Semitic movement was well underway. Wagner articulated it and gave it special twists, but he wasn't original. He didn't invent this. Just as, for example, the opening of Rheingold is stolen from Die Schöne Melusine of Mendelssohn, and he has more of a debt to Paulus and other works of Mendelssohn than he ever admitted. You never should take particularly any composer, but particularly Wagner, at his own self-representation, because he lied incessantly, and lied and tried to cover up the tracks of what influenced him.
We all know now, and we all associate Wagner, at least in some contexts, with the Nazis and with Hitler, because Hitler used it, his music. Mm-hmm. But what can you tell us about the influence of Wagner's revolutionary writings on the actual development of Hitler's own thinking?
I would say none at all. I would think that the connection with Hitler and Wagner is very much connected to the way Wagner was already understood by the end of the 19th century. Hitler's favorite composer was not Wagner, but Bruckner. And you have to understand that Bruckner is the person whom he actually had the closest identification with, an Austrian. And in fact, he created this great Bruckner cult and was extremely invested in the sort of spread of Bruckner's music. So it's not only Wagner, but Bruckner also that deeply appealed to him. The other thing that I would say about Hitler's relation to Wagner is that he didn't know enough about Wagner to know how much kinship there might have been. It is Wagner, after all, that when the Ring Theater burns in 1881, there was a big fire in the Ring Theater in Vienna. This was the Opera Comique of Vienna. And hundreds of people met their death. There was a fire during a performance of the Tales of Hoffmann, ironically by Offenbach, a great composer, by the way, a great composer, and a Jew. And when Cosima relates in her diaries that when the news came, Wagner's reaction was the best thing would happen is they should build a new one and get all the Jews in there and do a production of Lessing's Nacht an der Weise and burn the place down. Now, so you have to understand that Wagner's extreme destructive hostility of this kind was not even evident to Hitler, because those diaries did not exist. Now, Cosima was an unbelievable Nazi sympathizer, and so the family was extremely compromised by their relationship to the Nazi regime. But I think Hitler is less influenced by Wagner than by other intellectual developments that really came to the fore after Wagner's death in 1883.
You don't think that he read Das Judentum in der Musik?
Oh, yes. I think probably he did. I'm not sure. You would have to ask a Hitler scholar. I am not sure. I think the ideas in the Judaism and Music essay were so widely distributed by the time Hitler was born that he didn't have to read the original to figure it out. That Jews are not creative, they're only imitative, that they really are tied in with a kind of journalistic network of fashion promotion, and that really that the job of the artist is to go deeply beyond the superficial success mechanisms of modern capitalist commerce and go beneath the surface to reach the real essence of the people. All this kind of stuff was common anti-Semitic language.
To what extent do you feel the actual personality and that thinking is manifested in the so-called abstract music? I'm not talking about the music dramas, but in the other music. In other words, to what extent do a composer's political convictions really influence the music that they write and the way that music affects people?
Oh, I think that let's talk about how they write. How it affects people is a more complicated question. But let's say how they write. Let's stick with intentionality of the composer. Intentionality of the composer is very much influenced by political reception. And the best case can be in the evolution of late 19th and early 20th century music. Composers who essentially try to confront the audience with certain habits of listening that were, they thought, demeaned music. Good example is, we always admire Beethoven as a great revolutionary. But Beethoven then becomes his music, which is supposed to be revolutionary and shocking and new, and is used as a kind of Sherman tank, as weaponry against anything new. So it becomes a kind of club of conservatism, but in that club of conservatism is supposedly the free artist, the genius who didn't care about what people thought about him, who told aristocrats to get lost, all this popular image of the great free artist, the ideal picture of the person who has creative freedom at his fingertips. But yet, the people who now worship Beethoven used Beethoven to essentially demolish any innovation. Now, this irony is classic in the middle-class reception of music at the end of the 19th century. So people like Mahler, who took the symphonic form and interrupted it, broke the surface of sentimentality, really sort of shocked the audience by the mixture of irony and satire and grandiosity, that the sort of attack on the, I would say, on the conceits of musical culture of the middle-class audience had a relation to the Jewish question in two ways. Number one, they were attacking their own assimilated Jewish compatriots who were in the audience, who were now very comfortable that because of their culture and their taste, they were just ordinary citizens. So in a way, it was an inter-Jewish dialogue, Jew to Jew. And when Schoenberg really outraged the audience, and the critics who accused him of fraud, those were Jewish critics. Because they accused Schoenberg of stripping them of their hard-earned equality. Here they had worked hard to have good taste and to understand music and share in, as you would say, German culture. And here is another Jew telling them they don't know what they're talking about. They don't really understand Beethoven. They don't really understand Schumann. They don't really understand Mozart. They've just, now consume it the way they would consume Sachertorte. And they're just superficial culture groupies. They're not really serious about understanding culture. And if they really understood Beethoven, they would understand how aggressive, difficult, powerful, and undigestible and uncomfortable the music is. So they wrote undigestible, uncomfortable music to show them that's what really music should do. So it's a Jewish to Jewish dialogue as well as a Jewish to non-Jewish dialogue, as well as new composer to a tradition-bound audience. Now, in that context, starting in the late 19th century, how you wrote music was politically charged. There is no question that the modern in German culture after World War II became closely associated with the Jewish. In the collapse of the monarchy. So if you chose actually to take a style, if you will, call it a style, which is a bad word, but a way of composing that was not a neo-romantic, neo-Wagnerian view, you were accused of undermining the cultural underpinnings of a healthy society, and therefore you are a kind of corrupting influence. But there were Jews who wrote very conservative music as well. Now, can we call them assimilationist? Well, in many ways, yes. It's interesting that Marcel Rubin, the Austrian Jewish composer, who then fled to Mexico, the first opportunity he returned to Austria, even though nobody wanted him to come back. Korngold, the great film music composer, right, had a great success in Hollywood. He dreamed only of going back to Austria. And the Austrians didn't want him. It was a tremendous disappointment how unwelcome he was in a city in which his father had been the main critic of the paper, and he was the greatest wunderkind of the 20th century. And no one cared for him. And didn't come back because he didn't have success in Hollywood. He had great success in Hollywood. And yet there were other composers like Kurt Weill who wouldn't set foot back in Germany, stopped speaking German. And Schoenberg, who had nothing but very thinly disguised contempt for those who were dying to go back. There is the case of Anton von Webern, which is a very difficult case. An Austrian composer, a modernist, a student of Schoenberg's, who became during the war an absolutely enthusiastic endorser of the Nazis. Yet he was ostracized by the Nazis for the kind of music he wrote. He couldn't get work. So his aesthetic convictions were modernist and progressive, yet his political convictions were regressive. You can never overlap them. They don't neatly overlap. Not all Jews wrote modern music, and not all modernists were Jews, not all modernists were progressive, and not all conservatives were Nazis. It's all mixed up. But even in its mix-up, nobody ever lost sight of the issue. The issue was never far from any individual's mind because culture was deeply political and musical culture. The best example of that in the two novels that were published almost simultaneously, Hermann Hesse's Glasperlenspiel and Dr. Faustus by Mann. Both have music as a central issue of how to come to terms with the evolution of modern culture and politics. So, is there Jewish music? Of course, many critics during the 20s and 30s tried to identify Schoenberg's music as specifically Jewish, or Mahler's music as specifically Jewish. And I would say it is only indirectly so if one considers the place of the artist in the culture in which he or she was working. And insofar Jewish identity was a factor, it has to be taken in very indirectly. Mahler's sense of his own displacement and his confrontation in Vienna with anti-Semitism, which, by the way, was offset by the fact that he was the most lionized person in Vienna. He was a great success. He had very little to complain about. Now, it's interesting that Jews had another function in the musical culture of German-speaking Europe, and that is by being outsiders, they constructed a mainstream. The Johann Strauss dynasty came from Jewish origins, and I would argue that their ability to invent a myth of a cultural center, the Blue Danube and so, is only from the outsider status. The same is true in the United States of Aaron Copland. He was a homosexual Brooklyn boy, trained in France, who invented the modern language of the American landscape. I don't think he ever was in Nebraska or the Grand Canyon, but whether it's Appalachian Spring, or it is the Fanfare of the Common Man, or it is Lincoln Portrait, he evoked a sense of need that we have for a center to our culture, which may in fact not exist. So the Jew as an outsider helped also generate a centrist culture. Mendelssohn was taught by a very good friend of Goethe's, and there is a correspondence between the two of them about music. And in it, of course, they express a very similar Wagnerian notion that someone of his birth and race could be so creative as a musician. And the Zelter, the correspondence between Zelter and Goethe, in that correspondence, there is the kind of pre-Wagnerian anti-Semitism that one associates with Wagner, about sort of astonishment that someone from his side of the track, so to speak, from his race, could be so gifted as a musician. This is so endemic that it's not. The Jews were the major minority of Europe, Central Europe. And even a man like Szymanowski, the Polish composer, who had many close friends and colleagues, Fittelberg, who was a Jew, who helped him with his own music, and Kochainski, the great violinist, he writes the way we would say nigger, he says Żyd in his correspondence. He himself is not immune from a kind of anti-Semitism which was simply so commonplace that it's not a discussion. And I think that it would be hard to think of a German cultural world without it. But at the same time, there's nothing demeaning to one's Jewish identity or one's Jewish pride to be enamored of Strauss, Wagner, Goethe, Schiller. If we had to eliminate all the anti-Semites from our cultural tastes, we'd have a very narrow plate. The bookshelf would be very thin, and the sheet music would be very thin. And but that's true. If one ever wanted to take all the misogynists out of our cultural world, we'd be very impoverished. If we want to take all the racists out, we'd be impoverished. The only thing we have to do is not falsify them